I think we can get started. I wanted to welcome everyone to tonight's program. This is a look at the current state of refugee resettlement and immigration. And this is presented by Havurah Shalom and co-supported by Refugee Congress and HIAS. My name is Lauren Forking. I am a member of Havurah, but I'm also a member of the Sanctuary Committee at Havurah, which provides members of Havurah Shalom with opportunities to support and advocate on immigration and refugee issues at the local and national levels. Before we get started, we're very lucky. I want to play a short video from Oregon's very own Senator Ron Wyden that I think will help ground us in why we're all here tonight. So we'll start that now.
Ron Wyden here to join all of you in recognition of World Refugee Day with Congregation Havurah Shalom. World Refugee Day is personal for me. My family fled the Nazis in the 30s and not all got out. Both my mom and dad are clear examples of the millions of immigrants and refugees who've come to our country to build better lives and manage to build a stronger nation at the same time. As Oregon's United States Senator, I've long supported refugee resettlement efforts so more individuals can have the chance to seek refuge in the United States like my folks did. This has included raising the arbitrary refugee cap, pushing for a blanket fee waiver to streamline the process of getting Afghan families to safety. I've helped pass 2 bipartisan aid packages to Ukraine. This provides humanitarian, defense, and economic assistance to the Ukrainian people. And I've worked hard to pass bipartisan legislation to cut Putin off from global trade. There's lots more to do. And as the son of immigrants, I'm going to continue to push as hard as I can so immigrants and refugees are welcomed and supported here. Thanks to all of you. I look forward to seeing you in person soon.
Well, we're certainly very appreciative of Senator Wyden and all the work he's done to support policies that'll strengthen, improve, and sustain our refugee resettlement systems in the U.S. We're also grateful to Oregon's other members of Congress that have committed themselves to this work as well. Those include Senator Merkley and Representatives Bonamici, Blumenauer, and DeFazio. I know that we want to get this conversation started. Last month, the number of forcibly displaced people in the world surpassed 100 million. And while Ukraine and Afghanistan refugee needs are making the headlines, we don't always hear about what's happening with refugees in other parts of the world. We wanted to take the opportunity tonight to speak with some esteemed refugee advocates about the global refugee situation, the current status of the US resettlement program, and how Jewish congregations, communities, and individuals can help. So I'd like to introduce our speakers, but before I do, I just want to let everyone know that there'll be time for a Q&A from the audience at the end of the program. And at any time while we're discussing these issues, please put your questions in the chat. And Michael Rice, another member of Havurah Shalom Sanctuary Committee, will be compiling those questions and asking them at the end. And we ask everyone to stay muted throughout the program. And in addition to the Q&A, we're also going to be sending out a follow-up email with resources in the coming days. So if your questions aren't answered tonight, we'll make sure to get back to you with answers. So now on to our speakers. Naomi Steinberg is the Vice President of Policy and Advocacy at HIAS, promoting policies and legislation and helping to build support for HIAS's work and advocacy priorities. This includes a strong U.S. refugee resettlement program, robust international refugee assistance, and fair and humane asylum policies. Previously, Naomi was the director of Refugee Council USA, a coalition dedicated to refugee protection, welcome, and excellence in the U.S. refugee resettlement program. Prior to her work with RCUSA, Naomi was the deputy director of the Southeast Asia Resource Action Center. At CIRAC, she focused on building the capacity of community-based refugee-led organizations. Welcome, Naomi. Myra Dahgaypaw is so many things. One of my all-time favorite people to start with. Myra is a Refugee Congress delegate for Virginia and Senior Partnership Officer for Justice and International Accountability at Unitarian Universalist Service Committee. She's a Karen human rights activist from Karen State in Eastern Burma. Myra was an internally displaced person and a refugee before she resettled in the United States. Since a young age, she has been a community organizer. In the past 2 decades, Myra has been engaged with various human rights and political issues in Burma while serving her community and Burmese diaspora in the United States. Previously, she worked as a human rights advocate at the United Nations with the Burma Fund United Nations Office. She worked with the US Campaign for Burma for 12 years as campaign coordinator, policy advisor, and managing director, focusing on the US Burma policy, promotion of human rights, and an inclusive democracy that includes all ethnic and religious minorities. Becca Feathers is an independent advisor on international conflict and governance. She has also written 2 nonfiction graphic novels on civics and governance, the most recent of which, Why the People, was published last week. She's a co-coordinator of Havurah Shalom to Afghan Family Support Program, which is supporting an Afghan refugee family recently resettled in the Portland area. Bob Brown is an engineer by profession and worked in high tech for 25 years. He received his training as an organizer through Havurah Shalom's affiliation with the Metropolitan Alliance for Common Good, or also known as MACG. Bob currently works as an organizer and board member in areas of immigration, health equity, and racial justice. Bob represents all of Havurah's Tikkun Olam activities on the Havurah Shalom Steering Committee. He's also a member of the Reconstructing Judaism Tikkun Olam Commission. So I want to welcome all of our speakers. And this is a lot to talk about. So Naomi, if I could just turn to you first. I mentioned early on that there's this, I think, almost unimaginable number of 100 million people displaced in the world. And I was just wondering if you could provide an overview of the current global refugee situation. And also, because sometimes this can just seem like an overwhelming subject, if you don't mind also just giving us some of the definitions of what is a refugee, what is an asylum seeker.
Yeah, sure thing. Thank you so much, Lauren, and thanks to everybody for having me. I do want to apologize in advance. There's some significant thunder and lightning going through my neighborhood right now. So if anything flickers or if anything gets a little weird, that's why. And if you hear a dog barking, that is also why. I do apologize. But it really is an honor to be here with all of you, and a special thanks to Lauren, who has been such a help to me on so many issues. Before I dive into the actual question that Lauren actually asked me, I do just want to let all of you know about what HIAS is. I think most of you probably know, but I will keep this brief, but I do just want to let everybody know, just to be safe. HIAS is the International Jewish Humanitarian Organization. We provide vital services to refugees and asylum seekers in 17 countries. We advocate for the rights of forcibly displaced people to rebuild their lives and to seek and create a world in which they find safety, welcome, and dignity. We've been doing this for almost 140 years, and we do this coming from a deep connection, a deep grounding in our Jewish values, our history, our text, and our experience. Today, though, we serve refugees and other forcibly displaced people of diverse faiths, ethnicities, and backgrounds from around the world. So, with that said, so the question that Lauren actually asked me, it is time to contextualize what it is that we're talking about, to sort of pull back and take a look at the bigger picture. And here's a spoiler alert. It is not great. It is not good. As Lauren suggested or told us about a few minutes ago, according to the most recent figures from the UN Refugee Agency, there are now more people who have been forced to flee from their homes than any time in recorded history. That is a really sobering fact. And every year for the past decade, the number of people who have been forcibly displaced has increased. And as she said, by the end of 2021, people who've been displaced by any number of factors, including war and persecution and human rights abuses, reached 100 million people. Certainly, this has a lot to do with Ukraine, which was one of the fastest growing refugee crises since World War II. But there is, of course, displacement in every region of the world, even though much of it now is going unreported. So let's drill down a little bit into what that 100 million looks like and what these definitions really mean. So of that massive number of displaced people, an estimated 27.1 million of them, I should say, are refugees. And what does that mean? That means that they have fled across an international border, leaving their country of origin. They have to have crossed an international border. But in order to meet the legal definition of a refugee, one must have crossed an international border and been found to be fleeing because of persecution or fear of persecution based on at least one of 5 grounds. And those are race, religion, nationality, membership in a particular social group, and political opinion. So that is a huge number, but there are even more internally displaced people, meaning that they are, as it says, as it sounds like, displaced within their own countries. Right now, that number is up to 53.2 million people. There are now also globally an estimated 4.6 million asylum seekers around the world. And asylum seekers are people who have fled persecution or fear of persecution in their home country, or I should say people who are found to be eligible for asylum, and they're seeking safety in a different country, but they have not yet found legal recognition or refugee status. So for example, when we speak a little bit more about what's going on at our US-Mexico border, we'll be talking about asylum seekers, people fleeing for some of the very same reasons as people who come through the resettlement program. They just don't have that legal recognition yet. And I would say that, you know, I would obviously be lying to you if I said that this picture isn't bleak. It is bleak. Of course it is. These numbers tell a dire story. But before, you know, I pass the mic, so to speak, I do want to just say that there are some glimmers of hope. And rather than me being the perennial person that rains on everybody's parade, so to speak, I want to talk about some of the glimmers of hope here. We are starting to see a paradigm shift with refugee welcome. We don't need to look any further than what's happening in Europe. The speed with which European countries got on board with offering meaningful protection to displaced Ukrainians is unlike anything we've seen in recent times. Of course, including some of those very same countries who had a very different response to, let's say, when Syrians and Afghans were approaching looking for safety. The same can also be said of the US response to welcoming Ukrainians through the newly announced Uniting for Ukraine program. The last figures I saw, which were effective as of last week, is that more than 12,000 Ukrainians have already arrived in the US, with more than 35,000 already approved for travel. And, you know, I would be remiss if I didn't point out that there is obviously disparate treatment going on for Ukrainians, and we can talk more about that. But I think what's important to note is that that is not where I'm finding the optimism. We don't want Ukrainians to be treated as poorly as people seeking safety from other countries have been. What we want is for everyone to have meaningful access to seeking protection and being treated with dignities, just as Ukrainians have. But what this is showing us is that where there is political will, and that matches the will of the people at the local level who are doing refugee welcome, really things can be done and can be done quickly. And I do take some solace for that. So with that, I'll turn it back over to you, Lauren.
Thank you, Naomi. And it is, you know, this is a very challenging subject, and it is hard to find the glimmers of hope right now, but really appreciate you sharing all of that with us. And, you know, these numbers are huge, they're daunting. And I think we need to make it a little more personal. And we're so lucky to have Myra with us, who has been not only a refugee, but an internally displaced person before coming to this country. So Myra, if you'd be willing to share a little bit more about your story, we'd really appreciate it.
Thank you, Laura. Thank you, Naomi. And thank you everyone for joining us tonight. Indeed, thank you for the opportunity that I get to share my story. It's not fun, but I think it'll help us maybe get a little closer to what the internally displaced people and the refugees are facing before they get here. Is that they are facing with different kinds of brutality, one thing on top of the other. So basically my story is not really a unique one. Thousands, millions of people over there who are sharing the story I have. And so, yes, I was born as an internally displaced person. And since I knew myself, I was fleeing for life with my parents, hiding in the caves. Probably you might have seen some pictures. Sleeping in the rain with a small piece of plastic tarp that didn't even cover my whole little body. And there were times when we were so hungry, but then there was no food. I was the youngest, so I had to get something, otherwise I'm going to start crying, and the Burmese military army will be finding out our whereabouts, and everyone will get killed because of me. So basically, even as a child, there was no rights for me to cry at the time. And then, of course, later when my parents passed because of the brutality of the military, and then I came to the border to stay with my uncle. And so there were times when the military came and we had to flee over to the Thai side. But back then, because we didn't really cross the border and settle there, so I was still didn't consider as a refugee. If we go back to the definition, Naomi just clarify for us. And so, yeah, I went back and forth like that for like more than 10 years, almost like probably 17 years. But then it came 1995 when the Grand headquarters fell into the Burmese military's hands. Then we literally like pouring overnight on to the Thai side. And I remember too well, January 28, 1995. That's the day I became the refugee in Thailand. And so those refugees that fled at the same time I fled, many of them are still in the refugee camp along the 9 camps, along Thailand-Burma border. And are they safe? How is their living condition and all this stuff? Well, they are safe, somewhat safer comparing to Burma and in current state, only, behind the fence. But if they get outside of the fence, then they are subjected to arrest, torture, killing, and all this stuff for women, rape. So basically, refugees in the camp still don't have the rights to access to education or health and all this stuff, formal education and all this stuff. And so they have their own way of educating their own children. That's how I was educated. I didn't get a chance to have formal education until I got here. And, but I mean, that is better than a lot of other younger people back in the camp, because now we're talking about their future, but then they lost the whole we lost the whole generation where they don't even know what their future holds. And I was trying to be as brief as I can. And then living at the Thailand-Burma border, I fit into another definition, statelessness. So yeah, I had no document. We had no document, and we don't. Technically, I didn't belong to either Burma or Thailand. So yeah, in a sense, there. I was kind of like stateless in a sense. That is why when we talk about Rohingya statelessness, I can resonate very well how painful it is, and for them, and it was for me. And then when I came to the U.S. as a student, but I had to leave immediately because of the security concern that because of my work with the community that go against the military's rules and the pro-democracy groups and all this stuff. So I had to leave as a student, all of a sudden, and then when I got here, I ended up having to apply for asylum. So, I mean, this is my brief story for about 40 years time. Thank you, Lauren.
Myra, thank you so much. And I think it's a reminder of so many things. One, that no one is a refugee by choice or internally displaced. You know, when we hear these numbers, we know that many people have felt like their only choice was to flee where they came from. And also just a reminder of just how complex things are before you even reach a place like the US to be resettled, and how long people can spend in refugee camps or internally displaced camps. I wanted to move the conversation along a little bit. I wanted to open it up more about some of those challenges once people do arrive in the US. You know, I think Naomi, like if you want to speak a little bit about kind of the working on like the macro level on this with HIAS and just some of like the overarching challenges that you see, and other smaller ones as well. And I think, you know, Myra, I know you've worked with with communities here that are trying to be resettled and seen some of those challenges that communities and individuals face in that process. And I know, Rebecca, you've also worked legally with Afghans who are trying to come into this country through the humanitarian parole program. So if all of you don't mind sharing some of your thoughts on some of these challenges that the system and individuals are facing right now.
Sure. So I'll be the definition person tonight. I do just want to provide a quick definition of what we mean when we say resettlement, because it has a very specific meaning. It involves the relocation of people who have been identified as refugees from the country to which they fled, or one of the countries to which they fled, to a country that has agreed to admit them and grant them permanent settlement, permanent rights, a pathway to citizenship. It is really important to note that this option is available to only a tiny, tiny fraction of the world's refugees, less than 1%. But the simple answer is that the U.S. Refugee Resettlement Program is rebuilding. We're rebuilding while functioning, I would say, at a high capacity, but doing so during a significantly challenging time. If we were having this conversation 2 years ago, 3 years ago, 4 years ago, the challenges were very different because we were operating in a time of active attack against refugees and refugee resettlement, which resulted in the real atrophying of both a domestic and overseas resettlement infrastructure. There was a precipitous drop in refugee arrivals, and the resettlement scaffolding, what holds this whole program up, it was dramatically diminished and weakened. Now the challenges are more rooted in trying to rebuild after taking so many hits, while at the same time welcoming extremely high numbers of people. The metaphor that we're consistently using is that we're rebuilding the plane while we're flying it, which is not always something that I would recommend. But, as with most things in life, rebuilding something that was nearly destroyed is not easy. It's much harder to stand something back up again than it is to knock it down. And again, I have some numbers for you that tell a tough story. This fiscal year's refugee admission ceiling, the maximum number of people that we could resettle as a country this fiscal year, is 125,000. At the end of May, the most recent figures we have access to, the US had resettled 12,641 people. That is a stark and deeply disturbing gap. And you might be wondering why these numbers are so low, given the high number of Afghans who have arrived following the fall of Kabul, and now the increasing number of Ukrainians. And I know we're going to talk specifically about both of those a little bit later. But just in a nutshell, the US has welcomed 76,000 Afghans, and now through the Uniting for Ukraine program, we are starting to welcome Ukrainians with a maximum number of 100,000 Ukrainians able to enter. And as Lauren just talked about, most of them are not coming through the US Refugee Resettlement Program. They're coming with what is known as humanitarian parole. I'm not going to get into the weeds about what humanitarian parole is. I think that's going to come up later. I don't want to steal the parole thunder. But what I will say is that HIAS and many of the other refugee protection organizations thinks that humanitarian parole poses a real threat to the strength of the resettlement program, because it does not provide an immigration status to parolees. It does not place parolees on a path to permanency in the US. It does not automatically allow parolees to work in the United States, and it does not confer the same benefits available to refugees who come through the resettlement program unless there's an act of Congress. In addition, humanitarian parolees who feel that they cannot return to their home countries because of fear of persecution or violence, they frequently turn to the US asylum system in an effort to stay in the United States. And the US asylum system, as we all know, is overburdened, time-consuming, and nearly impossible to navigate without legal counsel, which is not automatically afforded to asylum seekers. And so adding large numbers of parolees' applications to the asylum process will absolutely add to the backlog, further extending the backlog, and leave asylum seekers in limbo for years. And then also, I think it's important to note that this over-reliance on humanitarian parole, one of the reasons that HIAS is so concerned about this is it's in violation of the 1980 Refugee Act, which is our legislation that is the foundation for our refugee resettlement and asylum program. The act was intended to eliminate the need for humanitarian parole in response to refugee emergencies, in recognition of the fact that the US needs to provide durable solutions to refugees through a structured program that provides long-term support for refugee arrivals, and that is not the case with humanitarian parole. So from a global perspective, there are now estimated more than 2 million people who are in need of resettlement in 2023. This is a 36% increase from estimates for this year. And obviously we all globally took a hit as resettlement countries during the pandemic. And while departures almost doubled, resettlement departures almost doubled in 2021, the gap between the need for resettlement spots and actual resettlement spots is significant. And so there's some real concrete, tangible challenges for the US Refugee Resettlement Program now, everything from the challenges provided by humanitarian parole to needing to rebuild after so many staff and organizations had to shut down during this last several years when arrivals were so low, to a weakened overseas infrastructure, to all sorts of things like that. But one of the bigger picture things for me that I think we really need to be cognizant of is that this issue has become deeply politicized in the United States. It is absurd, I think, given that the US Refugee Resettlement Program was based on bipartisan support. The 1980 Refugee Act that I mentioned was passed with full bipartisan support. More refugees have come in any given year under Republican administrations than Democratic. This was never a political issue before. This didn't used to be the third rail of political discourse. And we really, as a community, have to find a way to get back to those times. And that's not to paint a picture that, you know, in the bygone days, everything was perfect. That's simply not the case. But we are not going to be able to have a truly thriving US Refugee Resettlement Program again, as long as it is as toxic of a discussion at the political level here in Washington, DC. We know at the local level, it's not. The welcome is in abundance, but until politicians and influencers can get behind that as well, I think we really have our work cut out for us. So for me, that might be one of the biggest challenges here in the US.
Thanks, Naomi. And I don't know, Becca or Myra, if one of you wants to go next. Yeah.
Sure, thank you. So for me, I started getting involved with refugees, not just from Burma, but also some from Bhutan as well as Nepal, since 2007 in my personal capacity, but not really with any specific organization aside from community rooted in Community of Rooted Brilliance. They just changed the name. It was Coalition for the Refugee from Burma before, and I'm just getting stuck with the new name a little bit, sorry. And I have been a board member for about 6 to 7 years now. And it is an organization that provides newcomers with opportunity, with educational opportunities, and also create pathways for self-determinations as they wave into the situation that they're going to be living in and their newfound home at this point. So there are a lot of challenges that we're facing, especially when it comes to language. I'm pretty sure we all can figure that the difficulty speaking and learning in English. For instance, the refugees from Burma, we probably have at least over 100,000 or more, specifically those who are coming from the border and the refugee camps. And out of those, I'd say maybe 75% of those refugees don't know English at all. And out of the 75%, I'd say at least 1/3 of them are even illiterate in their own language. So when we're talking about illiterate, then yes, they don't really know ABCD. They don't know how to write their name, even in Korean. And that is why when they get here, there's all sort of problems filling in the forms, making friends, getting from place to place. And then they are put into ESL classes, but just because they don't even read their own language, so ABCD is nothing close to what they can comprehend. And that's very difficult for the parents as well as for the children. The education gap is so big. Like, I graduated from high school in the camp, and I realized when I came to the US, my high school there does not even equal to fourth grade here over here. And so for our younger generation, the teenagers especially, when the gap is so big, they couldn't figure out how to jump from here to there. And that is why parents are having a hard time dealing with the younger ones who are jumping between two cultures at this point. And parents also having a hard time raising their children, because now those who are going to school, they're also speaking in English and they're learning so fast, whereas parents are not catching up with them. So we're also having issues in the family, which a lot of times I find is so sad that we had before, when because parents don't know how to take care of their children in a certain way that in line with our rules and norms here in the US. And then the children are taken away from the parents without parents knowing what exactly the problem is, because they thought they take care of their children in the right way. But then that, of course, then it brings in the not understanding enough about the rules and norms over here, and also culture shock, culture clash, and all this stuff. And so, yes, these are the big issues, but also at the same time, it brings in like securing work as well as securing housing, and also knowing how to access different kinds of resources. And I mean, with all these issues that we've seen, I remember when I was in New York City, there were some refugees who came and resettled by the RRC. They couldn't even figure out how to make their way to the office. But then they're also expected to be able to be self-sufficient in 90 days, which means 3 months. I mean, I couldn't even comprehend, like, I do speak some languages when I first came, but then I wasn't even know how to figure my way around, and I got lost in the subway how many times. So yes, these are like literally the issues that they are facing. And that's not just the refugees from Burma, but I believe strongly from every other country, especially ones who don't speak the language. And the harder it is for the ones who are illiterate.
Thank you so much. I'll follow up on that a little bit. I think Naomi gave a really great overview of the scale of the challenges we're facing. And then Myra gave a really personal review of what happens when a family comes, or when refugees come, and the difficulties of resettling without necessarily the supports and structures that would help them do so. So I thought I would try to thread the needle in the middle there and talk a little bit about the process of actually getting to the point where you can come from somewhere else to the United States. And my experience is largely assisting Afghan refugees or Afghans seeking resettlement in the United States. However, I'm mostly going to talk about Afghans seeking humanitarian parole, which, as Naomi mentioned, is not actually resettlement, but it's just a temporary permission to come to the United States for a couple of years, to then try to file for asylum for permission to stay for a longer period of time. I volunteer, in addition to my work with Havurah, I have also volunteered as an attorney with Project Anar, which helps Afghans in Afghanistan file their paperwork and their applications for humanitarian parole. And so I'm drawing from some of the stories of families that I've worked with there. So imagine, please, if you will, yourself or your family in a similar situation. In order to apply for humanitarian parole, an Afghan family must provide first a series of paperwork or of documents that demonstrate that they are who they say they are, and that they are experiencing a sufficient threat to their lives and safety that make them need to leave Afghanistan. And in most cases, the United States government requires that that proof of threat be documented in some way. Now, in Afghanistan, it is most common for threats to be delivered verbally through a visit to a home or a family member's home. So it is very, very difficult for Afghans who are being threatened to provide the kind of documentation that the US government wants to see. And I'll just give you a couple of examples of the types of threats we're talking about. For instance, all Afghans who are employed at any US military base, no matter what their role was, whether they were a driver or a baker in the bakery, or someone who came in to fix the copy machine, or any kind of that position, had to have a security pass to allow them to be in the base. And that security pass put them into a security system. And when the Taliban took back over, they gained access to some of those security systems. So they have lists of Afghans who worked for the US government in various capacities. These are Afghans who would not normally qualify to come to the US under a special program that you may have heard of for translators or something like that, but they are in danger. So the Taliban will come to their homes, or come to their parents' homes, come to their brother-in-law's home and say, where is so-and-so? We need to speak with them. Perhaps they are related distantly to someone who used to work for the Afghan government, then they are in danger. They are required to provide by the US government a birth certificate or a document called a tazkara, which it functions in sort of the same way, or a passport or an ID card. Many Afghans who are applying for humanitarian parole have only a handwritten tazkara, or they have never had a passport, or they were attempting to apply for a passport when it seemed likely the Taliban would take Kabul, which means that all of their documentation is in a passport office in Kabul, and they would have to go to a Taliban-controlled passport office to claim that documentation for the purposes of sending it to the US government. So that poses some pretty significant threats to the families. In addition, every single person who submits an application for humanitarian parole must pay a filing fee of $575. That is every single individual, not every single family. That's just a fee that's out of the realm of possibility for most Afghans. Then, once they have collected all of that documentation, they need to find a sponsor in the United States. A sponsor is either a US citizen or a US permanent resident who is willing to say, for the purposes of the documentation, that they will take on any financial responsibilities that humanitarian parolee might incur when they come here, if they required public assistance or something like that. That can be an easier ask for Afghans who already have family in the United States who can serve as a sponsor, but for Afghans who don't have family here, that essentially means trying to find a stranger who's willing to vouch for them and willing to say that they will potentially take on this future hypothetical financial obligation. Once all of that paperwork has been filed, Afghans then wait, and they wait, and they wait, and for all the reasons that Naomi described, they can end up waiting for a very long time. And I'll just wrap up here by giving you some of the most recent numbers we know about parolees or parolee applicants, specifically from Afghanistan, which is that as of last week, approximately 46,000 humanitarian parole applications have been filed by Afghans. So between July 2021 and last week, 46,000. Fewer than 5,000 of those have been resolved in any way. And of those 5,000 have been resolved, only 297 applications have been approved. So 46,000 Afghans have applied for reasons of personal safety to leave Afghanistan. 297 of them have been permitted to, or have received humanitarian parole and are en route or in the United States. So that's a very small number, and the rest are just waiting. So I'll close there for now, but just if you can imagine your own families in that situation, trying to hide from enemies that would like to hurt you, gather all of your documentation, communicate with people in the United States, understand the US resettlement or immigration system, and do all of that from thousands and thousands of miles away.
Thanks, Becca. And I think that kind of goes to like our next kind of area of questions, is just that, there's the refugee resettlement program, but there's so many different statuses that people can try to come here with. And what that says is really affects what you can and can't do. And so, you talked a little bit about humanitarian parole for Afghans, and now it's somewhat different for Ukrainians. And this has also been used for people in other situations. But another thing that we haven't really touched on too much yet is the asylum process and asylum seekers coming into the country as well. So I know that I want to give Bob a chance to come in here to the conversation, because Havurah is doing some amazing work in that area. And then I know, Naomi, you were just at the southern border, so it would be really great to hear some of your experiences from there. And then Myra, I know, you've had so many different statuses yourself, so anything you want to share about that, and what, any more about your own challenges, and also what you've seen for other people, particularly pertaining to the status thing, that would be great to hear from all of you.
Okay, so asylum, right? So I guess I'll just start by just talking about what our congregation is doing in the asylum business, and then I'll just also talk a little bit about the differences between asylum and humanitarian parole and refugee resettlement from the personal perspective, those people who are trying to achieve that status. So in Havurah, we've had a very active sanctuary committee for about 6 or 7 years now. And in 2000, about 2 years ago, we really were given an opportunity to take our welcoming the stranger message to a completely different level. We were offered an opportunity to support a refugee family from Guatemala, a mother and her son, who came here. They were very, very lucky to come here. As many people know, the southern border is not very open. They somehow made it across the border, spent a little bit of time in New Mexico before they came to Portland, Oregon. Our community decided to take them in and to support them. And what that really meant for us was that we needed to build an infrastructure to do everything that was needed for this family. When asylum seekers come to this country and they're here, they don't have documentation status. They're not here with any kind of status, and their fear is very palpable. They are subject to being under the thumb of Immigration and Customs Enforcement. They have to go for monthly visits to make sure that they're still doing what they're supposed to be doing. They are not given work permits, so they don't have any ability to make money legally, right? So we brought this family in. We gave them housing, and we set up an infrastructure within our community. We raised a lot of money because it takes a lot of money, and we have a very generous community. We set up an infrastructure to deal with things like education, like healthcare, legal. As Naomi said, you can't go through the asylum process without legal support. So we had to figure out about legal support, they didn't have any ability to make money, right? So how does that work, right? So somebody comes here from another country, and they're seeking asylum, and for those same reasons that Naomi mentioned, those 5 reasons, those are the criteria. They don't have, their asylum process hasn't gone to fruition. They're just seeking asylum, and so they're in this limbo state. I think what's really important for people to understand is that what's going to happen to all these people who are going to be in 2 years when they're in humanitarian parole. They're going to be looking probably for asylum. Our asylum system right now is so backlogged that this family has been here for 3 years. They still have not. They don't even have a date for a court appearance to hear their case. And the word that we got from their lawyer is their date for a court appearance is probably 2 or 3 years away. So imagine now another 100,000 people kind of entering into that system, and you see that we have a very broken kind of situation. Now, people are here, which is good, right? But our systems do not support them at all. our family right now, I'll just give you a little update on the status. So they, they've been here. We've been supporting them for a couple of years now, and it's very heartening to build relationships with the mother and their son. They received their work permits. Both of them have work permits. Both of them are working. They are living independently in an apartment. So they are really making their way. The son is he just graduated as a junior in high school, and you can imagine what that was like for somebody coming from Guatemala to enter into our educational system. That was probably very difficult. It's just a very, very difficult situation. People might have heard of something called Title 42. Title 42 was a way that the previous administration was able to keep people out, and it was based on public health reasons, which made absolutely no sense. So people coming from certain countries would be denied entry, even if they were seeking asylum, which, by the way, is against against international and our own laws. So, there's been a big push to get rid of Title 42, but, I think people are afraid of opening the floodgates to a system that is completely not able to take them in yet. So the asylum system is very, very different than the other systems, than humanitarian parole or even the refugee resettlement process. People don't have a pathway to citizenship. So our family, when they go before a judge and plead their case, they could be denied. They could be say, well, not good enough, right? You didn't prove your case. Go back home, right? So, and they came for very specific reasons. I think I'm going to stop there. I just also wanted to give a shout out to another organization that Havurah works with, the Sanctuary Committee works with, the Jewish Coalition for Immigrant Justice Northwest. I know there's some people on the call right now that are very, from that organization, and I just wanted to just give them a big plug and push. They've done an amazing amount of work in the area of dealing with people who are detained and seeking, and they don't have status, but they're in a detention situation. So in Tacoma, Washington, there's the Northwest Detention Center. The Jewish Coalition has developed a bond fund, which in some situations will allow people to get out of the detention center on bond, which is an amazing job. So I just wanted to give a shout out to them, and I'm sure that Lauren is going to, when we send out a follow-up email, we'll give you information about the Northwest, the Jewish Coalition for Immigrant Justice. I think that's it. So what else are we supposed to talk about?
Well, I'd love to hear, Naomi, your own experiences from the southern border, and then also Myra, anything that you want to add on this as well.
Yeah, I kind of queued you up there, Naomi, right?
You sure did. You sure did. I was just thinking you make it very easy to follow you. Just several weeks ago, I had the unique opportunity to spend the better portion of a day with CBP, Customs and Border Protection agents in El Paso, Texas. And part of the experience included spending some time in a CBP shelter. So this is a shelter for people who have been apprehended by CBP after crossing the border and before they are sent elsewhere, whether it's to shelters for children before they might be able to be sent on to their families here in the United States, into detention centers, longer term detention centers, or in some cases immediately expelled under the policy Title 42 that Bob just mentioned, which we can talk about a little bit more. But what I saw literally took my breath away. When I walked into the center, I literally sort of had a sharp inhale. I was not naive to what I was going to see, but yet it is still somehow shocking. What I saw was the following. I saw what CBP wants to make sure I call pods, not cells. They were not cells as we see them from, prison movies with bars. They were big rooms with floor to ceiling windows, and they were over capacity, each room by several hundred people. People were packed in, wrapped in those the same blankets that people use after marathons. It appears to be tinfoil. I know it's not. Filled beyond capacity. I saw children who had entered the country by themselves, anywhere in ranging in age from, let's say, 8 to 15. That happened to be the cohort I saw. They were sitting down on the floor, lining the walls because their room was, quote, being sanitized. I saw people forced to stay in tents on the outskirts of this building in 96-degree heat with winds whipping sand at 35 miles an hour. I know how fast the wind speeds were because it was so high that when I went back to the hotel, I checked, and it was 35 miles an hour of sustained winds. There were rattlesnake sightings, and these people were being forced to stay outside, including with little children, because the inside pods were too full. And something I will never forget, and I know that sounds dramatic, but it is the truth. I saw a group of Haitian men, women, and children, the adults in leg shackles, being led onto what appeared to be a prison bus. There were bars on the window to be expelled back to Haiti under the Title 42 policy, which, as Bob said, was a policy, it's a World War II policy, a public health policy that the previous administration put into place under the guise of helping to thwart the spread of COVID-19. But what it really has been used for is an immigration mechanism, and it has essentially shut the border down to most asylum seekers. So for these Haitians, they were being sent back to Haiti without having the opportunity to formally seek asylum. And some of the women who were standing in line, when they realized, it just happened to be right as I was standing there, when they realized what was about to happen to them, they started screaming and crying, and I will never forget it. And so what I saw, as Bob said, was a profoundly, profoundly broken system. I saw a system that is overwhelmed by the sheer numbers of people attempting to find safety in the country, even with these extremely restrictive border policies still in place. I saw people at the same time who knew what awaited them in the United States, but were so desperate to leave their homes that they were willing to risk the indignities of the US border policies. And what we need to think about is everything that had to have gone wrong in their lives, the lives of the people in these pods, but in the tents, boarding the bus, before they made the gut-wrenching decision to try their luck in the United States. We need to think about our asylum policies that now expel the majority of asylum seekers before they can formally ask for protection, and which is, as Bob said, a fact that is actually enshrined in our domestic and international laws. And we do need to think about the Biden administration's really nascent plans to move asylum seekers through this backlog system faster, which is not a bad idea in theory, but we need to wait and see how this really works out. The bottom line is what we need is a humane, legal, and orderly process for everyone who presents at the border seeking protection. And we're not there yet. We are nowhere close. As we are talking, we are awaiting a Supreme Court decision on another anti-asylum policy known as Remain in Mexico, which is exactly, the formal name is the Migrant Protection Protocol. The irony is not lost on many of us, but also known as Remain in Mexico, which is a policy that has forced hundreds of thousands of asylum seekers to wait in Mexico while their immigration cases proceed in the United States. And we've already talked about Title 42, which is now, the Biden administration has attempted to end it, to terminate the program twice, but it is now caught up in the courts. And Congress has been playing around with the idea now for several months to try to codify Title 42 into legislation, essentially keeping it in place in perpetuity. So we're really fighting against that. So what we're left with is this really messy situation, which is people who are in real need of safety in the US and a system that is truly not equipped to handle the realities. So we are in need as a country for significant asylum reform. And that is the bottom line. And, HIAS is certainly, and I know all of you are working in many capacities to try to make that a reality, but our work really is cut out for us.
Thank you, Naomi, for going through all these with us. It is very important for us to get to hear. I don't mean to put all of us into this painful situation, but at the same time, it is also very important that we hear about this kind of information so that we understand some part about what the asylees at the border are going through. And in my situation, I take it as a big blessing because I didn't have to go through what they have to go through at the border. So like I said previously, I came in as a student, but then knowing that I wasn't able to go back. So my only option is to apply for asylum. And as a student, I was already in the country. I have only 1 year window to do this. Before 1 year turn up, if I don't do it on time, then yeah, I'm in a harder situation. So I put in my application, work with a friend who was a lawyer, but for some reason, we put in the application and everything. And then when I was given the interview date quite quickly at the immigration office in New York City. And then when I went into the interview was very fast. It didn't even take 5 minutes. The immigration officer looked through my paper, my application and all this stuff. I don't really know if she already went through it before she came to see me, but she asked me a question and I told her my name and where I came from and all this stuff. And then she was like, no, you're rejected. And then my friend who was a lawyer who accompanied me was asking, so on what ground? Oh, she was like, incomplete information. And she was like, well, we put in everything you asked for, the application asked for, so what else? And then she just stamped my passport then. And then she was like, okay, this is it. We take the passport, we take everything. And now if you wanted to reapply, you can reapply. But all the information, all the passport, the document that I came with was taken away. So now technically I became undocumented immediately then because my passport was taken away. And I came back and I couldn't figure out how else to go about. And my friend was also having to travel to Thailand to do her other job. And then she was like, I don't know what else to do. But then I have no other option. And I keep going back to where I stay and I couldn't figure out. But then also, this is why I say it's a blessing. When I was in school, there was another woman from Cameroon who fled her country. She's a gay, a lesbian, and she fled persecution. And she went through, she told her story to Human Rights First, and then a lawyer took up her case. Of course, it was a pro bono, but also it took a long time because of their workload, but also like Bob said earlier, because of the court date and all this stuff that's not assigned in a shorter time. So I called Human Rights First, and then I went in for the preliminary interview, and then, yes, they took my case, of course. And we did a lot of research. We did a lot of compiling information and all this stuff. And then we put in the application, and I think it was about 6 months. And then my lawyer and I, we received a letter. We received a letter saying that we have to come over to meet with a special agent. So when we went to see the special agent, he pushed over 3 big files. Each file is like 1.5 inches to 2 inches, those big binders, over to me. And he was like, okay, I trust your case, and do whatever you can, you need to, but don't screw up. I remember that too well, don't screw up. So I came back and I was like, okay, don't screw up, just stay in your own scope. So yeah, I continue doing what I had to do, but of course, I couldn't work legally because I didn't have any document. I was able to continue going to school with the former document because I was still able to, if I were still having my passport, I was still able to stay in the country for about a year before the renewal time comes, because the student visa lasts for 2 years. And but then because of I was undocumented, I had no access to any resources, whatever, not health, not education, not financial aid or anything. So literally, I was on my own. And then after that, my lawyer and I and her team, we came back, we do more research, put together more information and all this stuff. And then we put in the application again to the court. And I think it was quiet like for about 3 to 4 months. And then we got the court date. We got the court date, and then of course, after a year, and then we went to the court. The first time, very sadly, the judge didn't receive my files. So basically he didn't receive my case, so as the other lawyer, the immigration lawyer. And so, yeah, that whole year went by just like that, although I made it to the judge. And we came back, we wait for another court date, which came by probably about over more than a year. We went again, the judge didn't get the file. So the last time, it was already 5 years from now. So finally, the last time we were there, my lawyer was smart enough this time. She made literally copies for the judge as well as the immigration lawyer. And we got there, they didn't get it again. So my lawyer was like, okay, fine, you guys take it, look into it, and see what we can do for today. And thankfully, the judge looked through some of the executive summary and all this stuff. And then he talked to the immigration lawyer. He was like, okay, I trust her. I believe her case is solid. That is why I'm going to grant her asylum. But then the immigration lawyer came back and she was like, oh, no, I have to do my work. So it took up another some months. But finally, of course, it came through and I was granted asylum more than 5 years from the first application. But the thing is that being an undocumented person, the most scary thing is when the police is going to knock on your door and take you over to the detention and then deport you in 3 months, because that is the process. And so there were times when I was so like scared, because that also reminds me back when I was in Thailand, the Thai police came and stayed at my house, the door, my front door, to making sure when I come back and they can arrest me. And so sometimes I was also scared, like, am I supposed to go sleep elsewhere and all those kind of stuff? So yeah, so that is why I can certainly sympathize with those who are applying for asylum and not having any kind of documents in their hands. And many of my friends that I know who apply for asylum, who have been in harder situation where I was, and some of them even paid like thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars, but they still cannot get through. And last year I worked with one of the Burmese, the Rohingya person who was in detention in New Jersey to be deported back to Burma. It was very hard that in the jail, the person who doesn't speak the language and need a good interpreter, but didn't get a good interpreter. And so the judge almost threw away his case and deport him. But then thankfully, the lawyer was like persistent enough and telling me, okay, this is the last bit we're going to try and do. We're going to try and collect some information from the Burmese community to see if somebody can come forward and saying I know this person and he's a good guy. And so, yes, with all those work come together and finally he is now out, but he is stuck with mental illness stigma, because that's the only option we can figure, because he doesn't speak the language. If he speaks the language, probably he might be able to express himself, explain to the judge the situation or the lawyer and all this stuff. But he wasn't able. So finally, his lawyer was going through the route where, okay, aside from the language barrier, it could also be the mental issues. And I think that's why we ended up being able to get away with the whole deportation. But yeah, this is the reality that we, the asylees, are having to go through.
Myra, thank you so much. And I mean, I think hearing from all of you, just the overwhelming and daunting challenges that individuals face, it's just incredible and amazing that you were able to get through that yourself, and all the work that you're all doing to help other people that are in these situations. I think that's one thing that I want to just turn now to solutions, because we've talked so much about the challenges, but I want to talk about solutions because they are. And I think, Myra, one thing you said is that you felt so alone in that time period. And I think that it's the goal of all of us, for people that are going through any of these situations, to not feel alone. And so I'm hoping that, yeah, one thing I think that's really important, Myra, with your work with Refugee Congress, is really making sure that the advocacy that's done is refugee led. And I would really be interested to hear your thoughts on what's most important to you, what you'd like to see different, or what's working in that area. And I think Becca has some really wonderful information to share about Havurah's work with an Afghan family that we're going to be supporting. And I know that HIAS is just doing, and Havurah's work is very much closely led by HIAS's advocacy, that doesn't have to just be, yes, you have to support a family or find someone to take through the whole process. There's other ways to help. So I'm hoping that all of you can share some of that. And I'll be sharing throughout this just some of these resources in the chat. But again, we'll be sharing these in a follow-up. So don't feel like you have to get them all from the chat right now.
Thank you, Lauren. Oftentimes, we talk about refugee issues, we advocate on behalf of the refugees without having the refugees in the room. I think that's a very most important thing, and that is why the Refugee Congress is organized, work together to try and change the picture over here, because the Refugee Congress is literally comprised of the former refugees, asylees, the immigrants from many different countries spreading out in the US now. I think there are so many other solutions in different parts. I mean, in the US government, yes, we have to fix the Title 42, or that's a big deal. But also at the same time, I think the funding structure of the program also has to be modified in order to have enough funding for the refugee who arrives, who newly arrive, whether the number is low or not, but the most important thing is to have enough. When I worked with the refugees in New Jersey, a lot of times when I talk about giving enough support to the refugees, the agency was just telling me that, oh, this is all the money we have. We cannot hire somebody else who will be looking into the issues of the job or the health or getting access to different resources. And so, yeah, I mean, it could be because of not enough funding, or it could be the way the organization managing the fund. I don't really know, but I do wanted to say that we do need enough funds in order to support the refugee resettlement, especially when they first arrive. And it is not really fair to expect that they will be self-sufficient in 3 months. And also, I think it is very important to monitor where the funds go, because a lot of times we know where the fund goes, but then all we know is it goes to the agencies, but after that, where does it go? And a lot of times, I don't want to blame the agencies, but also I wanted to be frank with all of us over here that for some agencies, for them to be able to continue getting fundings, a lot of times they tick off the boxes that they have to, but they don't really pay so much attention to what is really happening and what's supposed to happen for the resettled refugees. And so I think that is something that I wanted to bring to our attention. But also at the same time, we can do advocating on behalf of the refugees. And that's when I wanted to say, yes, making sure that every level, whether local, state, or federal, no matter what we talk about refugees, please bring the refugee into the conversation so that they can share their personal story, like what we do tonight. And then that way we know what they're going through, and we know how to communicate better, and we know what exactly may be the next step. And I think having refugees in the leadership role is also important, because a lot of times, yes, we can tell their story, we can lead them, but at the same time, they are the ones who have the firsthand stories. So I'm so grateful that Laura and Lauren and everyone in the team, as well, the organizing team, as well as the audience, allow me to tell my story instead of someone else tells my story. And that is very important. And I'm so appreciate and privileged to be in the leadership role where I get to tell my own stories, but also other people's stories. And that's really amazing. And at the same time, maybe it's also important to respect the boundary when we ask them to speak to the audience, but not really forcing them to say certain things that we want them to say, but instead allow them to say what they are able to share at the time, because telling one story is not really easy. It's like revisiting that moment, which was very painful, and that pain re-exist again. It took me years for me to be able to tell my story. Before, I cried every single time I talk about myself. And that's why a lot of times I omit a lot of different pieces of my own story. Even now, I have to sort of like trying to keep myself together so that I don't start crying. So yeah, I think that's something that I wanted to share, and also making sure that we get informed consent so that the person that we are working with, knowing that, yes, their story is safe with us. We're not going to go out and spread their story if they don't want it. And yes, creating an accessible space for sharing is very valuable. I think it is very important for us to get to know each other, but at the same time, to allow them to learn what they need to learn so that they can be in the leadership position. And also maybe in some of the organizations, some refugees might be already working with you, maybe as a case manager or a case worker or something like that. If they are allowed to go through some level of education, and then maybe a step by step, they can get up to a certain leadership position, that'll be great. Yes, all in all, I just wanted to say, please include the refugees into your conversation, into your work, and give them the space so that they can integrate, whether for the day-to-day life, as well as in the leadership position. Thank you so much.
I'll speak very briefly because I know there are folks who have questions and I want to leave time for that. So all I'll say is that there are many ways to be involved in solutions, whether that is advocating to your members of Congress or to your state members or state representatives, because state legislatures also have a role to play in providing assistance for refugees. We've really seen that role very actively played here in Oregon. But for our particular group, we were inspired in part by the work that Bob and others did with the family that he talked about, the asylum-seeking family, and becoming aware of the great need Afghans coming to the US for longer term support than the refugee resettlement package or the 90 days of support that they get upon arrival. We set out to find an entity that would let us partner with a family and support them in the way that they defined that they needed, and so we're very, very happy to say that we have, after several months, been matched with a family. We actually just met with them for the very first time today, and so we're beginning the process of getting to know them. And one of the aspects of this that we as a group are looking forward to, and I know we've heard from others in Havurah who have worked with the asylum-seeking family, one of the aspects that's most rewarding is becoming a community with the refugees that we work with, not showing up to drop off donations and leave, or to provide a one-time service, but actually entering into a community relationship and letting everyone define what that looks like over a long period of time. So there are many ways to do that. I'll conclude just by saying that if you are in the Portland area, you don't have to commit to sponsoring or supporting a family through the entirety of their journey to be involved in that. There are lots of shorter time commitment and lower emotional commitment ways to support families as they arrive and as they get settled, and to help them feel welcome in the area.
So I'm going to do this very quickly as well. So certainly I'm biased as an advocate. So I will say advocacy, advocacy, advocacy. And in our follow-up, we'll make sure that you know how to do that through HIAS, should you so choose. And it can be on anything that we have touched base on, whether it's how to reform the asylum system, or I see Lauren just put on the side something about the Afghan Adjustment Act, that if it were to be passed, would automatically put those Afghans who came in on humanitarian parole on a path to getting their green cards and ultimately their citizenship. We are approaching the heart of the season when we are advocating for the next refugee admission ceiling for the next fiscal year, what's known as the presidential determination. We, as a refugee advocacy community, have decided that the number we're asking for is 200,000. And you might be saying, Naomi, didn't you just say we've only admitted 12,000 people so far this year? That's quite a jump. There are a lot of reasons why we're asking for 200,000, not the least of which is it's the right thing to do. It is the right contribution, particularly given the need, particularly given our retreat over the last several years as a country. But it also sends a really strong message to Congress about what's needed in terms of budgeting. As Myra was talking about, this program still needs an infusion of resources to be able to really resettle larger numbers of refugees. But there are other ways besides advocacy. When Lauren sends the follow-up, you will be able to see our Take Action page, and that can be everything from volunteering. We have a whole, for example, if there are any attorneys on the call, a whole pro bono network of attorneys that we provide significant support to help asylum seekers and other people seeking humanitarian protection. We also have opportunities to sponsor families, as has been talked about, through what we are calling welcome circles, so either Afghans or Ukrainians now. And because HIAS is operational in Europe as well, we're also able to help match individuals and groups who might not know a Ukrainian personally, but are interested in helping. And we can try to start to do a matching program there as well. And then, of course, donating is also a nice option. But there are all sorts of other ways that I'm sure I'm blanking on. So just check out our Take Action page. Oh, there we go. Yeah, thank you, Lauren.
And we will be sending that and all of these links in a follow-up email again, so don't feel like you have to capture them all from the chat. I know we only have 10 minutes left, but I want to turn things over to Michael Rice, who's another Havurah Shalom member, who has been reading the chat the whole time and getting everyone's questions. So I'm sure we're not going to get to all of them, but we will be able to get back to you in follow-up emails with any of the ones that are unanswered during the program. So I'll turn it over to Michael now.
Thank you, Lauren, and everyone and all of you who spoke. I've been involved with refugee issues, but I've learned a huge amount tonight. There are great questions. Everybody can see them in the chat. So I'm going to select a couple that I think are good to talk about. You've touched on that we need to work on the Afghan Adjustment Act. that Title 42 is tied up in the courts. Naomi, could you talk more about how Title 42 is now becoming something that is going to be a fight in Congress?
Yeah, sure. And just before I do, I just want to give thanks where thanks is due regarding the Afghan Adjustment Act. Representative Blumenauer has been one of the true leaders on the House side around the Afghan Adjustment Act. And so saying thank you is also a really nice piece of advocacy, letting him know that that is much appreciated is really important. But in terms of Title 42, yes, it is caught in the courts now, which means that it is still being implemented. But there have also been not idle threats. This is a real significant possibility that Congress will try to attach a Title 42 amendment to the vehicle they're thinking about now as a COVID funding package, which would essentially keep Title 42 in place for the foreseeable future. And earlier I was talking about, we need to rebuild bipartisan support for the Refugee Resettlement Program. I would say that one of the scary things about this Title 42 push on the Hill, on Capitol Hill, is that it is a bipartisan effort to keep it in place. And the reason that is happening is, as I was talking about, refugee protection issues, particularly what's going on at the southern border, is so politicized right now that there are a lot of Democrats who are running for office in the midterms who have felt that it is safer to come out saying we want to keep Title 42 in place. We want to keep restrictions at the border to keep people from even seeking asylum. So our work is cut out for us. You would be maybe surprised to know some of the people who have been speaking out saying we need to restrict access to asylum. So we feel like the threat is significant. This is a hard advocacy ask to get excited about, to ask somebody to ask for something in the negative. But what we're asking for is no asylum legislation right now. Nothing, because none of it is positive. We do not want to see a Title 42 amendment. We want people to stay far away from it. So what we really need is for people to really find some political courage and to stand up and to speak out against this, because you can have real valid concerns about what's happening at the border in terms of border management. I think that's a real discussion to be had. But what cannot be denied is that it is in violation of our domestic laws and our obligations to international treaties. And so for members of Congress on both sides of the aisle who care about following the letter of US law, it's important to speak up and to be brave and to speak out on the importance of ending this policy.
Let me ask a quick follow-up that actually comes out of one of the questions in the chat. And you gave us the numbers on the huge disparity between the applications of Afghan households and people, and the numbers that have been admitted and the numbers that have been rejected. Is that when you talk about avoiding legislation, does that put the Afghan Adjustment Act on the back burner?
No, so I should clarify, it's a good question. Avoiding asylum related legislation.
Okay.
So yeah, the Afghan Adjustment Act is a little bit different. We desperately want an Afghan Adjustment Act. So when I say avoiding legislation, I'm specifically talking about legislation right now focused on the US asylum system, because none of it is good. But the Afghan Adjustment Act is an extremely positive bill and would make a world of difference in the lives of the people with whom Becca is working and many others.
And just quickly, would that act deal with the backlog of the Afghan?
What the Afghan Adjustment Act, it would, in that it would allow those who came in on humanitarian parole to skip the asylum system, basically, because they would be able to get on the same path to getting a green card. I'm simplifying it a little bit, but it would allow them to get on the same path to getting a green card as if they had come through the Refugee Resettlement Program. When you come through the resettlement program, within a year, at a year, you are able to apply for your green card, which then of course puts you on the path to getting your citizenship. That happens automatically. That comes with, it is one of the benefits of coming in through the resettlement program. And that is not the case for parolees. So the Afghan Adjustment Act would essentially treat these Afghan parolees the same way as if they had come through the resettlement program, which would mean that they would not need to go through the asylum system. So in a roundabout way, it would help the backlog. Yes.
Okay. And then there was a good question about what the Ukrainian refugees may be facing, and the number is 100,000, but how is that process actually in place so that can move ahead better than, let's say, what we've been doing with the Afghans? And part of the question is, would there be a good, say, several thousand Ukrainians that might be resettled in our region in the Northwest?
Yeah, so the Uniting for Ukraine program, which was announced in April, is up and running. It is moving quickly, which again, I think is great for Ukrainians, but we do want to underscore that is not the same for Afghans, and we have not seen that the same for other populations. So there are some glaring disparities, but for the Ukrainians, it is working well. 100,000 is the maximum number, but thus far it's been more than 10,000. I think it was 12,000 who have already been admitted. Now, given that this program just launched several weeks ago, essentially that is an astounding feat. But it is not a resettlement program in the same way that we can predict who might be coming to the Portland area through the resettlement pipeline. They're coming in through parole, which we've already discussed, of course, but this program is different in that it requires a proactive sponsorship from the United States. It could be a family. It could be, it's my uncle who's in Ukraine. It's my grandmother. It could be a group. It could be a synagogue. It has to be people who are willing to sponsor, willing to essentially say, as Becca said earlier, that to take on the financial responsibility should that become necessary. And so it's impossible to track where exactly the Ukrainians will be going at this point. I would be shocked if there weren't applications in from the Portland area, but it's hard to predict. It really depends on where those sponsorship applications are coming in from.
Okay, here's a question I think would be good perhaps to hear from Bob or Maya. What can we do as individuals to counter political disinformation that's circulating about immigration and asylum issues? And it's probably not a short answer, but it's a great question.
It's a really great question. So I wish I had an answer, right? I really wish I had an answer. My answer to that is you got to keep working. You need to advocate. You need to be in touch with with your members of Congress. You need to be in touch with your community. And when there's misinformation and disinformation, you need to be able to call it out. So one of the things that's really great about this forum is that hopefully people got a lot more information than they had before. And so, speak to your friends, speak to people in your community when you hear about things that aren't right, that are just, that are biased or prejudiced, or because there's a lot of that out there. I mean, we live in this country. We have problems with people feeling like this replacement theory thing. So. I think you just need to be informed and be willing to address misinformation directly.
Myra, and I apologize. I misspoke your name a moment ago. Do you have anything to, anything to add on this information, the truth question?
Thank you, Michael. Well, adding on to Bob's list, well, get to know the refugee communities. I'm pretty sure if you want to find them, they are around you. So get to know them, see who they are, what are they doing, where they come from, how was their life before they get here, and also educate ourselves so that we can educate others. I mean, who wants to be the refugees? Nobody wants to be, including myself. And I'm pretty sure maybe some of you yourself, as well as your parents or great-grandparents. But the bottom line, having refugees, immigrants, asylees to be a part of us is not a bad thing. I think about 3 or 4 years ago, there was a big, an article came out from Fort Wayne, Indiana, saying that the Burmese refugees are dirty and because they chew betel nuts and then spit by in front of the laundromat. So that's why they literally like put on a note, no Burmese, at the laundromat door. And I was just like, seriously? And then they put on a whole bunch of comments. And then all I wrote is, okay, who wants to work 10 hours and get paid a day and get paid only $10 an hour? The refugees, asylees, immigrants, even undocumented. They're the ones who take on the dirty job on our behalf. So think about where our food comes from, where our clothing comes from, who does our dirty job. So yeah, I like what Bob said, call it out as it is. And when we see the action that comes through, like earlier, Lauren put on, just sign on to it. A lot of times people might think that that doesn't really mean anything by putting in your signature. I'm telling you, it means a whole lot for the people who need our help. Advocacy is tedious, but it is worth it. Thank you.
I think we might have, we're coming kind of to a close here. We appreciate everyone hanging in for an hour and a half. And Michael, thank you so much for asking those questions. It's so much to cover and we promise that we will provide lots and lots of resources. And this is being recorded. So if you want to watch it again and catch the things you missed, I know I'm going to, or if you want to share with others, please do. I just want to say that we started the idea for this event with a Havurah member who called me and said, like, what can we, this is so, there's so daunting. There's so much going on in the world. Like, how do we wrap our heads around what to do? And her solution was, we just need to open people's hearts a little bit more. And I think that we did that tonight, hearing from all of you. And I just really appreciate Naomi and Bob and Myra and Becca. Thank you so much for everything you're doing and for everything that you shared and your time that you shared with us tonight. We really appreciate it. And thank you to Refugee Congress and to HIAS and of course to Havurah Shalom for putting this on. So we wish everyone a great night and we look forward to being in touch in the future. Thank you.
Thank you
Thank
so
you,
much.
everyone.
Thank you. Have a
Bye.
good night. Bye-bye.